Now, let us begin the second session of the 14th Seoul ODA International Conference. Session 2 will discuss Achieving Greener Recovery. Please upload your questions using online question and answer system, SimFlow. Professor Jung Tae-yong, professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University, will take the role as a moderator. Professor Jung, please proceed with the session from now on.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my great honor to moderate this session with the eminent speakers from all over the world. And I thank the organizer, Koika, and especially Dr. Sonhyuk-sang, the president of Koika, who has been in this world for a long time. And it's my great honor to join this important and interesting conference. Well, as you know, the session 2 is about the achieving a greener recovery. And the session rule is very simple. We have 3 speakers. So each speaker has 15 minutes or plus minus, okay? And then we have obviously one round of discussion among the speakers. Then at the end, the organizer told me that we have live the comment and questions from the floor, online, offline. So we'll get 2-3 Q&As from the floors. And as I said, each speaker at the first, they have a 15-minute presentation, and let's do our own the discussion sessions. Before I start, let me briefly introduce our 3 eminent speakers. First of all, I don't think we need to introduce him, but Frank, the Lice Berman, who is a really eminent speaker in this field, the Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. I don't have to explain his long career and expertise. Please take a look at the program. Our second speaker, I think not here, I think from online, the Joyce Umsuya, who is the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP, who also has a long experience and career in this field. And our third speaker is Mr. Song Eun-yeop, who is the Vice President of Koika. So we have 3 distinct speakers. So Frank, why don't you start? Okay, please.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference about this important topic of greening the recovery. And indeed, I would be happy to speak about how green ODA can serve to cope with climate change and promote sustainable development as well. I'll first speak a little bit about the pandemic and the sustainability crisis, although in this conference many have already spoken about the health side, so I will not. And then I will talk a bit about greening ODA and its importance in general. And I'm coming up with 3 priorities for Korea's green ODA. I'll talk about green jobs, I'll talk about low carbon development, and about climate change adaptation. First, yes, we're all focusing on the pandemic, as we did in the first session. And the second key priority is clearly climate change. But I'd like to remind you that climate change is really part of a much wider sustainability crisis. And if you have a chance to watch, for instance, a recent documentary called Broken Boundaries by Sir David Attenborough and my good friend Johan Rockström, it is an excellent opportunity to see how these many different sustainability crises that are threatening our planetary boundaries are not just an issue of tomorrow's ill health, if you like. It really is an issue of human civilization. are we able to survive as a human species on this planet? That, I think, puts this very much in the forefront of our minds. And yes, then we had the pandemic, and others have already said it. The COVID-19 pandemic was an unimaginable shock to human development. Even the global financial crisis in 2008-2009 was a relatively small dip for human development. But last year we saw a very large decrease of human development as documented by UNDP's Human Development Report. So we are definitely a big step behind, and we have to find ways to green the recovery. Now, climate change, we usually see curves of CO2, and I've been working on climate change for many decades, and in the beginning of my career, this was something that we talked about as being important for our great-grandchildren, for future generations. But unfortunately, it has come closer and closer and closer, and right now, climate change is an immediate, urgent humanitarian crisis, with the UN estimating as many as 25 million climate refugees every year, most of them affected by floods, hurricanes, droughts, and conflict. So yes, what can we do? What can green ODA do? Now, green ODA is not a very common term. In fact, the OECD DAC tracks a number of environment-related markers. Environment in general, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, biodiversity, desertification. But as you can see here, they mostly overlap. I call all of them together green ODA, if only because green is definitely the term, not only in our name, Green Growth Institute, but used by many to show that we need to green the economy. So just to put this in context, how much ODA is there? It's an easy number. In 2019, roughly 150 billion ODA, 0.3%, quite a bit lower than the 0.7% that is sort of the agreed target. And I particularly want to call this number in mind because if you know how much money the world spent on COVID recovery in 2020, some $14 trillion was mobilized by countries on COVID recovery. That far, far, far dwarfs the amount of ODA. But of course, almost all of that money was spent in developed countries, and very little of that is available for developing countries. And I think that shows partly what the crisis for the green recovery means as well. Korea's ODA target was about 0.2%, and indeed it's growing, I hope. And Mr. Ban Ki-moon, my president and chair, has been urging Korea for many years to increase its ODA to get closer to that 0.7% of GNI. But today I wanted to tell you a bit more how large the green ODA so far is. And the best tracker of that is the OECD DAC, and they track the environmental share of bilateral aid. So total ODA is about 150 billion. The bilateral share in 2018, when their last report was about 113. And of that 113, roughly 31% was bilateral aid supporting the environment. And you can break that down into a small share that is environment as a sector, 3.7%, or focused primarily or principally on the environment, 7.3%, and having environment as sort of a significant co-objective. So altogether, that is about 31%. And then aid supporting climate, remember, mostly overlapping with environment, was about 26%. Just to give you an idea, 29 billion at that time. Climate finance, the world promised, already at the COP in Denmark a long time ago, should be about $100 billion a year from developed countries to developing countries. It's not been exactly that, but not that far off. This year at COP26, developing countries will make a big push to say, what is the next commitment? How much higher than 100 million can the world go now that the climate crisis is so urgent and green recovery is so necessary? A key thing you can see in this graph is that the share for adaptation is relatively small. Most of this climate finance goes to mitigation, to reducing emissions, which is important for all large emitting developing countries, middle income countries particularly. For least developed countries that emit very little but are most vulnerable to climate change, the amount of money going to them for adaptation is relatively small. The target is often to have 50-50%, but the world is quite far away from that. Where's Korea? Well, in 2018, which is the last report from the OECD DAC, the environmental share of Korea's ODA was quite small. The good news is that VP Son, in his presentation later in this session, he also has some numbers for 2019, where Korea's green ODA went up quite a bit, and I know from President Son that the targets are going to be to increase this more. So yes, in 2018 it was relatively small, but Korea's climate finance did have a larger share on adaptation than mitigation, which is interesting because it's quite different than the overall trend that I just showed you. Now, the average share of green or environment ODA was about 23%, but leading providers of green ODA are more in the 40 to 50%, except for the US, as you can see here. And then, of course, now that we are trying to focus on green recovery and Green New Deals, the EU, for instance, that is still finalizing its budgets for the next 7 years, but they are talking about increasing the green ODA share to as much as 50%. And certainly the civil society groups and the partners of the EU are pushing for that. So this is not the past, this is the future. This is the future of leading green ODA providers that Korea may want to compare itself with. It's also good to know that of total climate finance, bilateral ODA is a relatively small share. It is from the left, the third column. So it's a smaller share than the private finance that is climate related, which is also good to be aware. Well, GDGI does two things. We help government with climate policy, with green growth policy, but probably the most important part appreciated by our member governments is that we help them mobilize green and climate finance, partly from public sources like the Green Climate Fund, to which KOICA is now accredited. You'll hear more about that from Vice President Son as well, but also from the private sector. As much as 40% of that climate finance that we help mobilize for developing countries does come from the private sector. It is possible to find green investment projects that are commercially attractive. And sometimes it's possible to blend finance, concessional finance from ODA, together with larger amounts of private sector finance to leverage that. So yes, we work with developing countries on increasing their NDC targets, just as there is pressure on Korea to increase its NDC for 2030, ideally to 45 to 50%, which is still a big push. Developing countries are looking at the same thing and looking at the requirements they have in climate finance. We worked with about 30 countries. Many of them submitted those new NDCs. And I submit to you that those new NDCs of developing countries are a very good guide for green ODA for Korea as well. Those are the expressed priorities of countries that they're looking to finance. And there are also some new opportunities. At GDGI, we have a new carbon pricing group that looks particularly at ways and means where developing countries that don't emit much but have large forests, for instance, could sell some of those ITMOs, those carbon credits, to developed countries, including Korea, that can't reduce fast enough at home and become a source of finance for their climate action or for their sustainable development. I think this is an important area to follow, including for KOICA as well. So quickly, my time is close to up. There are some priorities for green growth ODA. Green job creation, I think, is particularly relevant in light of the green recovery. Green jobs, employment is the #1 priority of almost every developing country. Then low carbon development, and it is possible to have development that is low carbon, and particularly in least developed countries, focusing on climate change adaptation through climate smart agriculture and nature-based solutions. The good news is that investing in renewable energy creates more green jobs than fossil fuel alternatives. We had a report last year that said if Mexico, Indonesia, Rwanda just did what they promised in their NDCs, they would create millions of new jobs. And actually, just now, we finished a new report on green recovery and climate action, looking at about 30 of our member countries, you see the list here, and looking at the green jobs they could create by implementing their NDC targets in renewable energy and forestry. And then you'd see that there are millions of jobs to be had, particularly in middle-income countries for renewable energy, not as many for least developed countries. But that's mostly because countries like Ethiopia don't have a big emission reduction target. Their jobs are mostly linked to hydropower. However, Ethiopia, if they were to use renewable energy to meet their SDG 7, their sustainable energy target, then Ethiopia would have an additional 400,000 jobs in renewable energy, not linked to their NDC, but linked to their SDG 7 target. Jobs created in forestry are many times more, as many as 15 times more job years per $1 million invested in forests and improving landscapes, reforestation, rehabilitating degraded landscapes as in renewable energy. And this is a particularly good opportunity for poor people in countries that are have ravaged their economy through COVID. So let me show you a few of the projects that we are implementing together with KOICA, and then I'll end with that, in these areas. GDGI does not do that much on renewable energy with KOICA. We'd love to do more, but we have one project on renewable energy capacity building in the Pacific. It's been going on for some years. We do have a lot more projects together around supporting innovative SMEs, what we call green entrepreneurs or greenpreneurs, that GDGI has worked on for a number of years. And we have an interesting project, for instance, in the Philippines that focuses on agricultural value chains and supporting small SMEs as part of the recovery. And I think projects like that are a high priority for many countries. We recently also started a new project with you, signed a contract recently for recovery of the Aral Sea, an area struck by environmental disaster, where in a way recovery of these degraded ecosystems can generate green jobs for poor people. Then we have a project about to start in Ethiopia, which is all about restoring degraded ecosystems, and part of the goals that many countries have to plant trees. It will generate some 13,000 hectares of improved, restored forest land, but also thousands, many thousands actually, of green jobs. Similarly, in Nepal, we helped develop, together with the government, a project that the National Assembly hopefully will put the budget for later this year and then start next year, to work with workers that were displaced because of COVID, workers that are returning from the Middle East, all those overseas workers coming back to Nepal, being unemployed, to put them back into climate-smart agriculture in the Terai, combining recovery for poor people displaced through COVID with increasing climate resilience. Interesting projects. This is not a KOICA project per se, but a MAFRA project, also starting next year, on using digital and climate-smart agriculture to increase sustainable value chains in Senegal, all along those same lines. A whole series of projects like those. With Colombia, we've just put in a PCP to do similar work on green entrepreneurs in agriculture, also avoiding deforestation in the Amazon in Colombia. Then there's a different set of issues that are more urban, working on waste management. This is the one that you mentioned earlier. I think our partners from KOICA Lao were quite enthusiastic about this project. And it's the beginning of a class of projects focusing on improving the jobs of waste pickers, increasing the public awareness of people to recycle, to work more on the green, if you like, on a circular economy, and helping governments manage waste better, a critical priority. Similar project we're just signing in Uganda, working on waste management in Kampala, and indeed, the previous one was not Uganda, I was too quick. The previous one was a larger project working with the ASEAN, funded directly by MOFA, also about to start, to take the kind of work we did with KOICA in Laos to a number of ASEAN countries. And the next one is indeed a project we are about to start with you, with KOICA, in Uganda, giving you an example of the green jobs through that kind of work. I'll skip my last 1 or 2 slides, but we have an interesting proposal to work with refugees on green job creation in Jordan. And my final slide is summing up. There is indeed an unprecedented sustainability crisis going hand in hand with the pandemic that creates a terrible situation for poor people that are especially vulnerable to floods and droughts and cyclones and indoor air pollution. Well, Korea's aid was not very green in 2018, but is growing more green rapidly. And I think there are excellent opportunities for KOICA to work on a green recovery. I've shared with you some priorities: green jobs, low carbon development and adaptation. And GGI is pleased to work closely with KOICA and other Korean ODA providers. We believe we have a strong partnership, and we look forward to working with you more on greening the recovery together. I thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for your insightful talk. Well, our next speaker from, where is she? The Joyce Umsia, the Deputy Director General, Executive Director of UNEP. Hello, Joyce Umsia.
Hello. Hello, Professor John.
Nice to see you. Well, where are you? You are joining from Nairobi, or where are you?
Currently, I'm in Washington, D.C.,
okay.
but it's a pleasure to join you.
Okay, good. So, you have also 15-minute presentation. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, my fellow panelists, Frank, a good friend of UNEP, who is the Director General for GGGI, Vice President Song, KOICA, a very good partner as well, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I am very honored to join you at this 14th Seoul ODA International Conference virtually. I'm particularly honored to speak and follow Frank about the greener economy. I would like to begin with a favorite proverb of mine. Different versions exist, but all of them teach the same thing, that we do not inherit the world from our ancestors, but borrow it from our children. In this proverb lies the very essence of sustainable development, that we must work to ensure our children grow up in a world that is at the very least no worse off than the one we found. It is a teaching that our species has failed to learn. A recent UNICEF report lays this out in stark terms. And let me quote some of the findings of the report. 1 billion children are at extremely high risk from climate change and other environmental threats. Heat waves, flooding, cyclones, lead and air pollution, vector-borne diseases, to name a few. As they intensify and worsen, these horrors are undermining the full spectrum of children's rights, from access to clean air, food and safe water, to education, housing, freedom from exploitation, and even their rights to survive. We are handing our children an increasingly toxic world. Nowhere is this truer than in developing countries, where the multiple overlapping shocks a child suffers are severely damaging their chances of living healthy, fulfilling lives. And this will only get worse as the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis intensify. So what can developing countries do to reverse the cause? How can we recover from the shock of COVID in a way that leaves our children a planet that is in better shape than we found it in. Before I answer this, I want to be very clear that we already know where we need to get to. The Sustainable Development Goals provide us with a map to a bold and beautiful vision of our shared future, a future in which hundreds of millions of people no longer go to bed hungry every day, where poverty no longer harms 1 in 10 people, and where quality education and lifelong learning opportunities are available to all. But if we have a map, then we have yet to find our bearings. By the end of 2019, the world's efforts to achieve the SDGs were already off track. Then COVID-19 struck, plunging the world into the worst recession in a century. Global poverty is on the rise for the first time in more than 2 decades. And as bad as the pandemic is, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss poses an even greater existential threat to life on Earth. We may recover from the pandemic in the short term, but unless we do so in a way that addresses the planetary crisis, then we can wave goodbye to the SDGs and to our chances of leaving our children the world they deserve. So how do we recover? How do we find our bearings and walk towards our shared future? The answer comes in 3 parts. First, we must avoid the development mistakes of the past. These are fueling the triple planetary crisis in ways that are putting urgently the Sustainable Development Goals out of reach. Second, we urgently need to redirect recovery spending from the sectors, industries, and infrastructure that are causing the most harm. And third, we must need to put nature at the very heart of our decision making. I'll begin with the first point. The conventional response when faced with problems like poverty, hunger, and unemployment has been to grow more, expand more, build more. Economic growth in particular has been seen as a panacea, a one-size-fits-all cure for all of the world's social problems. And there is truth in this. Massive advances in some parts of the world in areas like poverty reduction, access to electricity, and maternal and child health would have been impossible without economic expansion. And yet, the type of growth we have witnessed and the forms of development enjoyed by high-income countries over the past century have come at a terribly high cost. The infrastructure we have built, roads, buildings, transport, industries, and electricity account for 3/4 of planet heating greenhouse gas emissions. Every day that we invest in business as usual and carbon dependent projects leads us further down the wrong path. This same infrastructure and the consumption patterns that it facilitates fuels the biodiversity crisis. Almost 95% of all deforestation in the Amazon occurs within 6 kilometers of roads. We can and must plan our infrastructure better to minimize these types of outcomes. And it's the same story for the pollution crisis. The air pollution, chemicals, and waste that are destroying human health and well-being are a direct consequence of the economic and social development paths that we have chosen. So this is the first key point I want to make. In recovering from the pandemic, in lifting people out of poverty, hunger, and ill health, it is crucial that developing countries avoid the mistakes of the past and the present. Infrastructure that supports human development and well-being is badly needed, but we just need to do it differently than we have in the past. And Korea has good examples in this. I had a privilege of living in Songdo, Incheon, the greenest city in Korea. Today, we have an unprecedented opportunity to do just that, to get it right. That's because most of the infrastructure that will exist in 2050 has not yet been built. It will take trillions of dollars of investment per year to build, and most of it will be built in developing countries. So how do we get it right this time? To begin with, developing countries must immediately shift their recovery spending away from harmful investments that fuel the triple planetary crisis. This message is clearly not getting through because more than 80% of the 2.5 trillion US dollars in recovery spending is going towards business as usual investments. This is a grave mistake. These investments will lock in the very greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and biodiversity loss that are undermining human well-being and destroying the ability of nations to achieve the SDGs. They also make little economic sense. We know that green fiscal spending can deliver stronger economic returns than traditional spending alternatives. For example, investing in energy efficiency and renewables generate 5 times more jobs per $1 million than investments in fossil fuels. And given that $31 trillion is needed in energy investment up until 2040, directing that money towards energy efficiency, building retrofits, smart grids, and renewable energy supply and storage will be a win for the planet, our health, job seekers, and investors. Equally, rich fruits are available for countries that invest in green transport, green research and development, green skills programs, and natural capital. The last piece is critical. Natural capital, the living world that sustains us, must be placed at the heart of the recovery, especially in developing countries. That's because many natural capital projects don't require the types of highly skilled labor that are often lacking in emerging economies. These countries also tend to rely heavily on nature-based sectors like agriculture and tourism. So nature-based solutions have the power to safeguard the most critical parts of their economies. Health ecosystems also provide a vast number of vital benefits for people: crop pollination, water filtration, medicine, flood and storm protection, disease prevention, just to name a few. Regenerating and protecting these life-sustaining ecosystems through nature-positive food production, for example, can alleviate hunger, reduce poverty, and increase equitable employment. Natural capital also plays an important role in climate action. Later this year, member states will meet in Glasgow to discuss implementation of the Paris Agreement and ambitious NDCs. It is crucial that countries work together to increase the investments in natural infrastructure, mangroves, coastal wetlands, forests that are essential to tackling the climate crisis. So I have outlined some of the ways developing countries can recover from the pandemic without worsening the crisis or sacrificing economic growth. But I want to be clear that none of this will be possible without adequate financing. $6.9 trillion is needed per year until 2050 for infrastructure investment that meets development goals and is aligned with a low carbon, climate resilient future. Yet, there is a large gap between these needs and current investment trends, especially in low and middle income countries. These countries need help closing the gap, especially as they struggle with the economic fallout from COVID and a growing debt crisis. That's why I want to echo the Secretary General's calls for debt forgiveness and generous foreign aid programs. Generous grants and concessional finance from international partners are urgently needed if we are going to make the priorities that I have outlined today a reality. And so we stand at a crossroads. The paths before us could not be clearer. We can either carry on as before, choosing a business as usual development path that plunges us deeper into the triple planetary crisis, or we can course correct by realigning our actions with the vision laid out in the SDGs. I know what I want, and I know which path every single child on this planet would choose if given a choice. So let us seize the unique opportunity we have to ensure that the world we return to our children is fit for them to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joyce. I know that it's too early in the DC, but thank you for your speak. Our last speaker from KOICA, Mr. Song Ung-yeop, floor is yours.
Thank you, Moderator Professor Zhang. Achieving a greener recovery through Green New Deal ODA becomes more important than ever due to global depression caused by COVID-19 pandemic and the worsening negative impacts of climate change. Today, I would like to talk about what is Green New Deal ODA and its funding trend, both at global and the Korean national scale, and also I would like to introduce KOICA's strategy and efforts. Let's see, what is Green New Deal ODA? Unfortunately, no internationally and commonly accepted definition yet. Back in 2009, the UNEP explored what is Global Green New Deal in its related report and suggested three broad objectives. Firstly, to make a major contribution to reviving the world economy, saving and creating jobs, and protecting vulnerable groups. Secondly, to reduce carbon dependency and ecosystem degradation, putting economies on a path to clean and stable development. And lastly, support for sustainable and inclusive growth, achievement of the MDGs, actually today's SDGs, and eradication of poverty. In this report, highlighted sectors for recommended fiscal stimulus include energy-efficient buildings, sustainable transport, sustainable energy, and agriculture and freshwater. Actually, we had just before same diagram. This diagram shows each scope and also relations between climate and environment-related subsectors. Since we do not have a clear definition for the Green New Deal ODA, it generally refers to climate-related development cooperation, or well known as just the Green ODA. And climate finance is currently the most widely used terminology, both in policy dialogues and statistics, with regard to Green New Deal ODA concept. Let's move on funding trends. If you look at the total bilateral ODA contributing to climate objectives from the OECD DAC donors, it stood at $34.4 billion in 2019, which accounts for approximately 28% of total and 14% increase from 2015. Among them, 43% went to climate mitigation activities, 33% to climate adaptation, and 24% addressed both mitigation and adaptation. Let's see who are the top donors in bilateral climate objectives ODA. It is too small letter. Actually, Germany is the largest donor country, followed by Japan, EU, France, and the UK. And South Korea stands as the 7th largest donor country. Now let's see the Green New Deal policy and the funding trend of the major development partners such as the US and the EU. I'm not going to go into details. However, I can say their common goals are achieving 2050 carbon zero and rapid energy transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. Green New Deal policies very much focus on economy-wide low carbon transitions. US climate ODA funding has been decreasing during the last Trump administration due to the fact that climate change was not the top policy priority, which results with that only 3% of bilateral ODA allocation went on climate objectives. However, according to the strong Green New Deal policy in the current administration, climate finance is expected to be rapidly increased. On the other hand, EU shows a relatively steady funding trend to climate ODA, while spending 30% of total ODA allocation. European Green Deal is also a top policy priority, and so climate funding increase is expected. Now I would like to move on Korea's Green New Deal ODA strategy. The Committee for International Development Cooperation, CIDC, of Korean government announced the Green New Deal ODA strategy in July this year. According to the strategy, Korean Green New Deal ODA covers climate, biodiversity, desertification, and environment-related supporting ODA activities. In terms of OECD marker system, Rio marker and environment marker projects are taken into account. In 2018, Korea's Green New Deal ODA took 19.6% of total ODA volume, and Korea targets 28.1% by 2025, which is the average proportion of OECD DAC countries. for a vision to lead global climate change response and green recovery, Korea has three strategic objectives. Firstly, to support partner countries' green transition by increasing the shares of green ODA above the OECD DAC average by 2025, supporting the establishment of a Green New Deal ecosystem fit for partner countries, and excavating flagship projects tailored to partner countries' needs. Secondly, to support Green New Deal ODA by leading global discussions and initiatives on Green ODA, enhancing South Korea's leadership on the issue, including the GCF and the GGGI, and expanding partnership with the UN agencies and MDBs. And lastly, to expand the mutually prosperous partnership with partner countries, enhancing synergies with the other domestic and foreign policies, and increasing effectiveness by following up with the old project. In Korean government, climate change became a top policy priority. That's why ODA funding to climate action more than tripled in 5 years. In 2019, Korea committed $1 billion ODA to projects targeted action against climate change, which represents 30% of its bilateral allocation, above the DAC average of 23%. Korea ranks at 7th in absolute terms of climate ODA, compared to 10th in relative terms of ODA as a share of GNI. By the sector, energy and infrastructure accounts for half of climate ODA, and 38% went for general environmental protection. And by the type of intervention, mitigation funding accounts for 74% of total due to infrastructure investment by the EDCF loan. In case of KOICA grant ODA, approximately 70% went for adaptation. Now, let me introduce KOICA's Green New Deal ODA. The bottom line is that KOICA is fully supporting and implementing the Korean government's Green New Deal ODA through grant ODA. In this context, to limit climate risk and achieve 2050 net zero and climate resilient development, these strategic objectives are three. Firstly, for achieving 2050 net zero by supporting low carbon transition. Secondly, supporting partner countries' green recovery and climate adaptation by enhancing urban ecosystem and infrastructure climate resilient. And lastly, expanding green climate partnership, including climate finance and technology areas. Recently, KOICA successfully passed through GCF accreditation reviewing stages. That means KOICA's ODA policy and project management capacity meet global standards. Blended finance, such as KOICA grant ODA combined with the GCF climate finance is expected to contribute to global green recovery and further enhance development effectiveness. With the GCF partnership as a momentum, KOICA will keep strong environment and social safeguard, and gender policy will be applied to future KOICA projects. Before I finish, let me briefly introduce a case project of KOICA. This is Agrophotovoltaic project in Fiji. The project finance includes KOICA grant, GCF loan, private equity finance, and Fijian government co-financing. Altogether, it becomes around $16 million US. Main objectives are to support 50% transition from fossil fuel to clean energy by solar power plant. The project also targets to enhance the food security and the local income increase by increasing agricultural productivity. The project is particularly meaningful for Fiji because the Fijian government announced to 100% transit to clean energy by 2035. This project is expected to trigger Green New Deal in the Pacific area and to contribute to green recovery. Just a moment. Finally, I would like to wrap up my presentation. The key commitment of Korean Green New Deal ODA is to significantly increase the share of green ODA up to 28.1%, which is the OECD DAC average by 2025. To meet the target, development cooperation needs to be expanded in its target sectors, such as green mobility transition and smart green city development. To do so, innovative financing schemes, such as public-private partnership, blended financing, and the GCF matching fund is required for larger-scale climate actions. Green New Deal project at larger scale will bring an enhanced development effectiveness. On the other hand, mainstreaming climate consideration for the entire ODA activities, at least for all infrastructure supports, is also required for partner countries' green recovery. Through the Green New Deal ODA, KOICA will dedicate to global green recovery and green transition. Thank you very much for paying attention.
Thank you, Mr. Song, for introducing Ambitious Korea's Green New Deal program. Well, we have 35 minutes or so, and this remaining time, we're going to have the discussions and the Q&A. I think the participants from the Zoom, they have already sent us filing up these many interesting questions. Let me do it in this way. The first 1-2 questions, I'll raise the question to all speakers. So, we have a 1-2 round of our own discussions, and then I'll pick up 1-2 questions from the floor. The first question, I think, Frank, I think in your presentation, it was quite impressive, and I'm very curious. You highlight that the importance of climate adaptation finance, especially in developing countries. And in my opinion, I think this is one of the most important issues, and also developing countries are very keen in this issue, right? Especially for achieving a greener recovery. So, Joyce, you also there, right? And I saw your CV, and you have a long time experience working in that boring Washington, D.C. main hall and H building. I think maybe some years ago we might bump each other over there. So she has also the long time experience of this financing. So pick up from the Frank very important message. The Frank, how, based on your own experience and expertise, I think over all our speakers, how are we gonna, promote, how are we gonna help the promoting this climate adaptation financing, especially for developing countries? Maybe you can start from Frank.
Okay, well, adaptation finance is behind, if you like. It is easier to find investable projects related to renewable energy or even sustainable transportation. It's more difficult to find good, large projects that are interesting to the private sector in adaptation. So there will be a larger role for ODA funding, there will be a larger role for concessional finance. But the good news is there is a lot of employment in these adaptation projects. As I showed, forest-related projects, either conservation, but particularly, which is a priority in many African countries, to help restore degraded lands through reforestation, is and can be very labor-intensive, doesn't require many skills, so it's a great opportunity for green recovery and then building sustainable livelihoods, ideally combined with climate-smart agriculture. But yes, while there are some areas like solar irrigation, which may be attractive for private investors and where we can match that with value chains that provide some commercial products, but this is an area where I think concessional finance and ODA will be required, so it's also a key priority for organizations like KOICA to focus.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Joyce, in your presentation also, I think you highlight the importance of, the climate adaptation, linking with the SDGs and so on. So what's your view? How to promote the climate, the adaptation financing, especially for developing countries?
Thank you, Professor John. Just building on what Frank mentioned, we see two potential opportunities. I mean, one is the global advocacy for adaptation financing. So if you look at one of the key components for the forthcoming COP26, it's the financing package. And so the global advocacy is absolutely central. I do think countries like Korea and other OECDs bringing the voice to Glasgow on this particular issue, and that's where KOICA becomes extremely important, is absolutely central. So that is at the global advocacy level. At the country level, as Frank mentioned, blended finance is a very attractive instrument. But what we have seen thus far when it comes to adaptation financing, the appetite from the private sector is not where it should be. So I would like to say that, and what we are trying to do as well through, for example, UNEP's private sector initiatives, is actually advocating and providing data and science to private sector entities to show them what may be the upside for the private sector. I think a core component, again, building on Frank's point, will remain concessional financing and grants. Entities like the Green Climate Fund, but also ODA, would absolutely have to play a key role in developing countries when it comes to adaptation financing. Over to you.
Thank you, Joyce. And you helped me to bridge your blend financing. When I listened to Mr. Song at the end in his slide, he also highlighted this blend financing from the KOICA's point of view. So, Mr. Song, if you want to add a little bit on this blend financing, the issue, also the Joyce also raised it. If you want to add.
Yes, Thank you, moderator. Actually, in order for us to pursue more large-scale climate-related activities, we need more large financing source as well. So in this regard, blended financing scheme, it would be very beneficial. For example, as I mentioned just before in my presentation, COICA's grant ODA combined with the GCF finance would be a good example. And also public-private partnership and other, the private sector MDBs such as as a conclusion, we need a more diverse financing source in order to tackle the very critical climate-related crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Song. My second question to all the speakers, I pick up one from the Joyce presentation. If I summarize your talk, maybe you highlight a lot of the SDGs interlinkages while we are tackling this the issues, and especially the SDGs, the first part, SDG 1 to up to 6. That's basically social human development thing, and in your talk you say the human well-being related. So to recover, our theme is how to achieve a greener recovery, right? That's the theme of this session. But how to combine this more hardware recovery, especially economic recovery, with the more important human dimension, social recovery. So I want to, ask you to elaborate a little bit of this SDGs first, the goals. That's for the social development or human well-being and so on. So this time, let's start from Joyce.
Thank you, Professor Jang. Your question is quite timely and relevant for the following reason. As you know, UNEP is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. That's where I am based. And we do have programs both in emerging economies, middle income, but also low income countries. For the most part, I'm trying to generalize here, a lot of environmental issues are actually people development issues. If you think about where we are today with the pandemic, most developing economies are facing and will face quite competing demands when it comes to the recovery part of the pandemic. Two, because of the slow economic growth, which is a global phenomenon, and developing countries are even more affected, you can imagine the number of jobs and the disruption of the economic systems and development activities in the country that are facing and will continue to face developing countries. And yet you have, for developed countries, including OECD countries, a bit of contraction economically. So the ODA numbers projection is too early to tell, but it will be interesting to see how much ODA will be going into the developing countries. So for us, the SDGs provide a very solid development framework that also encompass environmental dimensions, including climate change, but also economic recovery. I think too, it is important to connect the dots. If you take a simple climate change challenges in most developing countries, they're really development challenges. So it is important to put the interventions grounded on data and science in the context of SDGs, but equally important, the national development plans. And GGGI, Frank and his team have done excellent work when you think about recovery in the context of green economy. So that's where I was coming from, for people, but also for planet, embraced by the SDGs. Over to you, Professor Jang.
Please, Mr. Song, can you elaborate a little bit at the KOICA's program on the SDGs 1 to 6, or social development related, or?
Yes, as you know, KOICA's main goal is to do their best to reach the SDG goals in many ways. And in particular, as we know, COVID-19 pandemic is no longer a health crisis alone. It is social and economic crisis already. So, and the climate change becomes a code red to humanity. And in this regard, KOICA is doing their job, in particular to support and implement the Korean government's Green New Deal ODA, and in particular, the developing countries has disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So KOICA is mainly focusing on the developing countries' green recovery through more diverse climate-related support projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Song. Frank?
Yes, first I'd like to emphasize that we define green growth as growth that is environmentally sustainable but also socially inclusive. So we think of that as very much a part of green growth. And yes, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic and green recovery, employment, green jobs is a #1 criteria. So I'd like to make 2 points. One is that when we look at climate projects, for instance for GCF, the key impact that is usually mentioned is the amount of greenhouse gas emission that is reduced. Many people don't realize that those same projects can also have a very large employment benefit. And particularly that projects can be designed to have not only a greenhouse gas emission reduction effect, but to have an employment benefit. And then you can take it one step further and design projects specifically for vulnerable groups. So that's why I gave you the examples of projects that we have proposed to KOICA, one in Nepal, where we're particularly focusing on these unemployed returning international workers, basically a group immediately affected by the pandemic, and then to support them through climate resilient agriculture. So yes, it is inclusive social development, while at the same time focusing on making the agriculture system more climate resilient. And in Jordan, same thing. They are hosting a very large refugee population. In the first place, those people need to be helped with, camps. In the second place, they all look for work. And then it's good to know that the large majority of employment is actually generated by the informal economy, by small and medium enterprises. So we have a big focus on stimulating entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs to set up their own small businesses, and then particularly help women and young people start innovative green businesses to create employment. And yes, the project in Jordan I mentioned then specifically focuses on the refugee population. So I think it is actually possible to combine these different goals. So the best projects are the ones that are focusing on those first SDGs, as well as SDG 7 on energy, and have a positive climate impact.
Thank you, Frank. I'll have 20 minutes or so, and then let's go through the very interesting questions from the floor. Well, I'll do my best to translate this Korean very interesting questions. And this is general question, but this climate crisis, and also I think due to this COVID-19, this food crisis, and I think Frank also mentioned that in your presentation, this food crisis is very impacting to the vulnerable country, especially the developing country, and according to this question, including Korea. Korea is also very vulnerable to this food security. So how are we gonna tackle this food crisis issue? And I know, Frank, I think before you joined GGGI, you have done a lot this food-related programs. So let's start from Frank. How to do this the food crisis?
Well, food scarcity is a bit like vaccines. It's not that we don't have enough food in the world, but it's that poor people don't have access. Right. So it's an equality issue in the first place. And yes, the chronically poor have also become more chronically food insufficient, right? Hunger and poverty have both increased. So focusing on those vulnerable groups and then combining that with forms of climate-smart agriculture. For instance, in Senegal, we're working to replace diesel pumps by solar irrigation. So yes, that reduces emissions, but more importantly, it makes the agriculture system more climate resilient, and is a great way to provide income that increases the ability of poor people to buy food. The food is there, but they need income to be able to have access to food. So I think climate smart agriculture, you have to unpack the box of what climate smart agriculture is, but really offers an opportunity to work on both poverty, food security, adaptation, and even emission reduction.
Well, Joyce, let me translate this question. How to deal with the SDG goal number 2, the food hunger, how to deal with this food crisis due to climate the crisis or the COVID-19. So how to handle this SDG goal number 1 or 2?
So thank you, Professor Jang. You're absolutely right. I think the COVID pandemic has severely disrupted the food supply chains across the globe. And just like you mentioned, in addition to developing countries, also developed world food prices, for example, have gone up. So specifically on SDG 1 and 2, 2 suggestions. One, at the end of this month, as you may know, Professor Jang, the Secretary General will be hosting the Food Summit in New York. And part of that high-level meeting, which will attract the highest level of participation, is looking at the food systems, especially during and post-pandemic, taking the lessons from the pandemic to see the kinds of transformations towards SDG 1 and 2 that the whole world could come together and do. Because if there is one lesson learned from the pandemic is how interconnected the food supply chains are. So that is one at the highest global level. I think at the country level, particularly in developing countries, I would argue for some countries, it's still too early to tell because the pandemic is still a humanitarian issue. The vaccines have not reached most of these poor countries to actually sit back and reflect on the lessons. But specifically on the hunger, it's looking at smart agriculture, looking at public-private partnerships in the agribusiness, but also looking at blended finance to support the domestic and regional and sub-regional food supply chains. So that's what we are currently seeing anecdotally, but it's a bit too early for majority of the countries to see how the transformation would look like at the country level. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Well, Mr. Song, you advertise the COICA's activity on SDG 1 or 2?
Yes. Frankly speaking, the food crisis, mainly because of the climate change, is very critical and very difficult to tackle with. Anyway, COICA is doing our best to support and provide our experience and technology in relation with agriculture. In particular, as you know, Korean society has a very typical experience like Semaul movement, the New Village movement. And we were before agricultural society, so we have accumulated agricultural technology as well. That's why KOICA is exerting to share our agricultural experience and provide the agricultural technology in order for our partner countries to increase agricultural productivity. Thank you very much.
Well, before I go to the next question, I think let me go back to Frank. I think your point is very interesting. If I understand you correctly, well, food is there in developing country. The point is then how to harvest, right? So how to provide the capacity for them to secure their own food rather than getting something from outside. Can you elaborate a little bit? I think you gave us this Senegal's example, but in general,
In general, food waste is higher than hunger, right? So there is large amounts of food that don't reach poor people. And in cases where there is hunger, there are many examples of places where people were hungry during a famine. The country had food, but poor people were not able to buy it. So this poverty and food insecurity go very much hand in hand, right? So if we are helping people to have sustainable livelihoods, and yes, in Africa, the large majority of poor people live still in rural areas, so their way out of poverty is going to be through agriculture. So strengthening their agricultural systems to provide better livelihoods can go hand in hand with tackling the climate challenge, because they're very vulnerable to increased droughts and floods. The cyclone Ida in Mozambique had a huge impact on their economy, far greater even than the COVID pandemic.
Right.
So that's what I'm talking about. In a way, old-fashioned poverty reduction combined with new climate change adaptation can provide sustainable livelihoods, and in the short term, employment for people that have become unemployed through COVID, to bring together these different SDGs, these different development goals.
Well, before I move, Joyce, you want to add, or I can move to the next question on this issue?
Yeah, I think the story is much more complex, I would argue, because if you look, there's actually a study that came out last week in a country like the US, where the number that was cited in this particular study was that there is on average 40% of food wastage. So also the story of sustainable consumption and production is one at the core. I think two is on the climate impact on the agriculture, water scarcity. If you look at the Sahel, for example, clearly the climate story is key when it comes to hunger and other development SDG. I think the pandemic has compounded the problem. And then the links with infrastructure. There is a lot of waste of food, largely because there is no storage facilities, for example, moving food from rural parts. I live in Kenya, just rural parts of Kenya to Nairobi. And the road conditions, for example. So the links with the green infrastructure and the opportunity to actually improve, linking it to the food supply, there could be an opportunity post-recovery. So those are the 2 points that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Well, the last question from the floor, I think this is very interesting and controversial. Well, according to this question, I think to all the speakers, well, the green, climate-friendly, environmental-friendly technology, that green technology is known to be more expensive, right? According to this question, then we keep highlighting the importance of this green ODA. But if you see the cost point of view and effectiveness of your ODA, instead of this green technology-based ODA, the regular-based ODA is more cost-effective. How are you going to claim that this green ODA has a much stronger point than green technology-based ODA is much stronger than this non-green technology-based ODA? Very interesting point. Yeah, I think we're going to start. Joyce, maybe you can start from there.
Thank you for putting me on the spot, Professor Jang. It is a very interesting question. I would actually be very interested as well to hear from our friend, Vice President Koika Song. I think expensive is relative, because I was actually reflecting, for example, Korea has been at the forefront of technological innovation, including R&D. I mean, I keep on reminding myself, in '67, Korea was the low-income country, same as Ghana, Tanzania, and many, many African countries. But if you look at the impact of technology in Korea's development story, I think one, and Vice President Song alluded to that, as part of the ODA, the soft side, it will be sharing Korea's experience when it comes to technology with other countries, including in increasing agriculture productivity. So the soft side of ODA should not be underestimated. Now, on the financing, I would argue it depends what you mean by expensive. For example, there is a lot of technological innovation around geothermal investments. Kenya is leading towards that. Korea has actually supported some of that. And in the medium long term, the cost of energy supply for middle income and low middle income Kenyans has relatively gone down because of the ODA investments that have gone into geothermal. So I think it's important to take not only a short-term view, but a medium and a long-term benefits of the green ODA.
Thank you, Joyce. Very convincing story. Well, Mr. Song.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. In my personal opinion, the ODA effectiveness, it depends on the evaluation, how to evaluate. In a short term, it could be the non-green ODA would be cheaper than green ODA, something like that. But in a longer term basis, I believe, and I strongly believe, that the green ODA would be more effective, because the climate crisis is a very critical crisis to humanity as a whole. So in order for us to tackle this climate crisis, we need solidarity and the cooperation among all of us. So if we evaluate and monitor only in a shorter term and in a very limited area, it could be. But as a whole, in a planet basis, we need a more comprehensive and more basic approach to tackle the climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Let me give you the professional economist answer. Green ODA is not more expensive. Green ODA is cheaper. And I've been answering this question for decades. And for most of those years, we always had to bring in a somewhat difficult concept of environmental externality or health externality. That means, yes, if you were building power plants for Seoul, coal was the cheapest, if you don't count the health impacts. if you don't count all the health costs that you have to take from people that get sick from air pollution, and in fact, the millions of people that die from air pollution. 2 days ago, I was speaking on the Blue Skies Clean Air Day in Seoul, and we had a presentation from Professor Wang from China that showed that the investments of China in clean air, every dollar reduces health costs by $8. Meaning it is hugely cost effective if you don't take the financial, but you take the economic argument. And that has always been the case. Short-term cost might be cheaper as long as you don't count the environmental cost, the climate change, the biodegradation. So it was always the case that from an economic perspective, which is what governments should take, green ODA was better. Now my job arguing this to governments has become much easier for, in many cases, like in renewable energy, even the financial, even the out-of-pocket cost of green ODA have become cheaper. So now we can show to governments, you want to build a coal-fired power plant? Coal-fired power, just at the power price, is going to be more expensive than renewable energy. So you're stealing from your own wallet if you're building a coal-fired power plant. And that asset will be more expensive for the next 30 years. So our job has become much easier because even in a simple financial sense, many green investments are now simply the best investment. But if you add on top of that the environmental cost, the climate change cost, it is so easy to demonstrate that it is the cheapest way.
Right. Well, as an economist, if I sum up the answers of these three speakers, in your ODA equation, if you add this time dimension and also this externality factor that Frank mentioned, then the three speakers said that the green ODA is not expensive. Okay, I think that's the last question, and I have 3-4 minutes to go. So instead of running one more round, I'm going to ask each speaker to wrap up, to sum up your own the presentation plus discussion. So I think that's better than running one more round of discussion. Let's start from Mr. Song. I think. Yeah, 1-2 minutes.
Thank you, moderator. Actually, COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented crisis. And to put an end to the pandemic, as I told you just before, strengthening global solidarity and cooperation is required. In this regard, I sincerely hope all the participants of today's conference would share the insights and ideas on how to tackle global development challenges and promote a better future for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Song. Joyce, before you answer, I think please give my regard to your Danish boss, okay? Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Definitely I will pass on your regards to Inga. I think just 2 points. One is we are at a very unique opportunity as part of the recovery to make real impact on not only the recovery, but also climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and the pollution, the planetary crisis, as UNEP calls it. So what the world is looking for is actions. We have all the science, we have all the data. The IPCC report was very clear. I think let's get on with the actions to reverse business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank?
Yes, in the 1 minute, it is code red for humanity, right? The pandemic, the climate crisis, and moreover, scientists tell us we have so little time. This is a decisive decade to try and give ourselves an opportunity to give our children a healthy planet. So I'm extremely happy to learn, this is after all the Korean ODA conference, to learn of KOICA's and Korean ODA's Green New Deal strategy. of the rapidly increasing green share of the green ODA in Korea's support for developing countries, and looking forward to partner with KOICA and other ODA providers in making that happen. Thank you.
Well, obviously, this live discussion plus this active and productive discussions, it's beyond my capacity to sum up our discussions. So I hope that each one of the participants, you digest it and you have your own conclusion. And before I closing, I especially ask all of you to thank all three speakers and all the participants. Thank you, and let me close up this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of everyone, I would like to thank Professor Jung and speakers of session 2. There will be a 20-minute break, and we'll start session 3 at 9:10, which will discuss creating more inclusive digital future. We also look forward to your continued participation for the next session. Thank you.